A starving wild horse chased a rancher for miles under the Wyoming sun. What she was leading him to would change his life forever. Caleb Monroe thought the pale shape in his rearview mirror was just another starving wild horse, desperate and confused in the summer heat. He never imagined she wasn't chasing his truck for food, or for herself. With ribs showing and legs ready to give out, the mare was running on something far stronger than hunger. She was asking for help. And what she needed him to see was hidden far from the road, waiting in silence. Caleb Monroe had learned over 6 decades of working open land that the road home was the only honest conversation he still had. The gravel highway cut through the Wyoming high plains like a faded scar, stretching straight and unforgiving beneath a sky-bleached pale by late summer heat. His pickup rattled along at a steady pace, the engine humming with the tired loyalty of a machine that had hauled feed, fencing posts, and more memories than Caleb cared to inventory. He was thinking about practical things, the cost of diesel, a call he needed to make about livestock insurance, whether the north pasture would hold through another dry week, when a flicker in the rearview mirror pulled him out of his thoughts. At first he dismissed it as heat shimmer. The afternoon sun had a way of bending distance, turning air into water and shadows into lies. But the shape didn't dissolve. It steadied. It moved. Caleb squinted, easing his foot off the gas just enough to test his eyes. Behind him, framed by the long ribbon of road and the wavering horizon, something pale was running, not drifting, not veering off toward the sage. Running straight down the center of the road, head low, legs churning with a desperate, uneven rhythm. "A horse," he muttered, the word dry in his mouth. He checked again, half expecting the shape to vanish the way mirages always did. It didn't. The animal drew closer, close enough that he could make out the sharp angles beneath its coat. White. No, not white. Dust gray. A color earned, not born. Even from a distance he could see ribs lifting and falling like the slats of a broken gate, skin stretched thin over bone. Caleb felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the reflexive irritation of a man who had seen too much hardship to pretend surprise. Starving wildlife wasn't rare out here. Drought pushed animals into bad decisions. Wild horses sometimes strayed too close to roads, drawn by the false promise of movement and shade. Usually they spooked and disappeared the moment a vehicle slowed. This one didn't. He pressed the accelerator gently, telling himself he didn't have time for this. He had fences to check, paperwork waiting on the kitchen table, a voicemail from a veterinary care provider he'd been putting off returning because he already knew what the bill would sound like. The truck climbed to 45 miles an hour. The horse matched him. Caleb's jaw set. He drove faster, then steadied again, glancing at the mirror with growing unease. The animal's gait was wrong, stumbling, correcting, pushing forward on sheer stubbornness. Foam flecked its mouth, its neck stretched low, as if the effort of holding its head up was already too much to ask. "Go on," Caleb said aloud, though there was no one to hear him. "Get off the road." The horse didn't veer. It didn't hesitate. It ran as though the asphalt itself were the only solid thing left in its world. A mile passed. Then another. Caleb's irritation began to thin, replaced by something colder. Wild horses conserved energy. They didn't chase. They didn't waste strength following a 2-ton truck through heat that pressed down like a physical weight. This wasn't hunger alone. This was urgency, raw and focused, burning through whatever reserves the animal had left. He slowed despite himself. The truck coasted, tires crunching softly as he eased onto the shoulder. Dust settled around him in a lazy cloud. In the sudden quiet, the sound of hooves grew louder, ragged, uneven, frighteningly close. Caleb turned in his seat just as the horse drew up short behind the tailgate, sides heaving, legs trembling as if they might fold at any second. Up close, the sight hit him harder than he expected. The mare, because now he could see she was a mare, was a wreck of angles and scars. Burrs clung to her mane. Old marks traced her flanks, pale lines beneath the grime, the kind left by rope or wire. Her eyes, though, were what stopped him. They weren't dull, they weren't vacant. They were sharp with something that looked uncomfortably like intent. Caleb opened his door and stepped down, the heat rushing back around him. He grabbed a bottle of water from behind the seat, the plastic warm to the touch. When he held it out, the mare flinched, then steadied herself, taking a cautious step forward. She drank fast, too fast, water spilling down her chin and onto the dust. "Easy," Caleb said, softening without meaning to. "Easy now." She took only a few swallows before pulling back. That was when she did something that made his breath catch. The mare turned her head, looking past him, not at the truck, not at the road, but toward the broken land stretching away to the west. She took a few steps in that direction, stopped, and looked back at him. Her ears flicked. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, urgent bursts. Caleb stared, the bottle still hanging uselessly from his hand. "No," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "That's not how this goes." The mare didn't move. She waited. For the first time in years, Caleb Monroe felt the road fall silent beneath his feet, as if it were holding its breath. He followed the mare's gaze toward the distant folds of rock and scrub, a place with no reason to go and every reason to avoid. The practical part of his mind began lining up objections: time, cost, risk, liability. But none of them quite reached his mouth. Because standing there, with the wind dragging dust across the road and a starving horse watching him like a question he couldn't ignore, Caleb understood one simple thing. Whatever she was running from or toward wasn't behind her anymore. And whatever waited ahead was important enough for her to spend the last of her strength asking a stranger to follow. He capped the bottle slowly, his eyes still on hers. "All right," he said at last, the word landing heavier than he expected. "Show me." "All right," he had said, and the word still hung in the air as Caleb Monroe shut the truck door and watched the mare turn away from the road. She didn't bolt. She didn't rush. She moved with a deliberate, almost careful pace, as if every step had been measured against the strength she had left. The gravel gave way to dirt, then to hard-packed earth, scored with old tire marks and animal trails. Caleb followed on foot at first, the truck idling behind him like a question he hadn't answered yet. The mare glanced back after a dozen steps, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that left no room for doubt. When he didn't immediately follow, she stamped once, the sound sharp in the quiet afternoon. It wasn't fear. It wasn't aggression. It was insistence. "Easy," Caleb said again, though this time the word was meant for himself. He returned to the truck, killed the engine, and stood there for a long moment with his hand on the door. The wind carried the smell of dry grass and hot metal. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark called, its song thin and lonely. Caleb took the keys from the ignition and slipped them into his pocket, a small, irrational gesture that felt heavier than it should have. When he turned back, the mare was already walking again, slow but steady, heading away from the only road that led home. They moved into land that didn't care about human plans. Sagebrush scratched at Caleb's jeans. Loose stones rolled under his boots. The mare picked her way through it all with a practiced caution, favoring one hind leg just enough for him to notice. Every few minutes she stopped and looked back, waiting until he closed the distance before continuing. It was not the behavior of a panicked animal. It was the behavior of a guide. Caleb felt sweat gather beneath his hat, trickling down his temples. His knees complained as the ground tilted upward, then down again. He told himself he was only going as far as the next rise, that he would turn back once he knew what lay ahead. But each time he reached the point he had marked as his limit, the mare was already beyond it, pausing just long enough to make sure he saw her. "Don't push it," he muttered, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. "You don't know how far I've got left in me." The mare snorted softly, a low sound from deep in her chest, and kept moving. Time stretched. The sun slid lower, its light shifting, from harsh white to a warmer slanted gold that pulled long shadows across the ground. Caleb became acutely aware of the sounds around him, the scrape of his boots, the rasp of the mare's breathing, the whisper of wind through dry grass. His world narrowed to the space between her hooves and his next step. He noticed then that she wasn't simply walking at random. Her path bent around obstacles before he saw them. She avoided patches of loose rock, skirted shallow dips that might twist an ankle. Once, when he slowed to catch his breath, she turned back and nudged his arm with her muzzle, not gently, not roughly, just enough to remind him she was there. Her nose was warm. Alive. "Yeah," Caleb said quietly, surprised by the tightness in his throat. "I'm coming." The land grew rougher as they went on. Low hills rose into broken ridges, their sides carved by old runoff channels now dry and cracked. Caleb's shirt clung to his back. He checked his watch and frowned. They had been walking far longer than he'd intended, and the rational part of his mind began to tally the risks again. Dehydration, injury, the simple fact of being alone in country that could swallow a man without noticing. Still, he didn't turn back. The mare slowed near the crest of a small rise, her steps shortening, her breathing growing more labored. She stopped there, head hanging low, sides shuddering with effort. For a moment, Caleb thought she might finally collapse. He closed the distance carefully, speaking in a low voice he hadn't used in years. "That's enough," he said. "You've done enough." She lifted her head just enough to look at him, then turned it toward the land beyond the ridge. Her ears pinned forward, every line of her body pointing ahead. She took one step, then another. Each one looked like it cost her more than the last. Caleb climbed the rise and followed her gaze. Beyond it, the ground dropped sharply into a narrow basin, cut deep into the earth, like a wound that hadn't healed right. Scrub trees clung to the sides at odd angles, their roots exposed where soil had long since eroded away. The air down there felt different, cooler, heavier. Even from above, he could smell something faint and sour beneath the dust. His stomach tightened. He looked back at the mare. She stood beside him now, trembling, her strength visibly ebbing. For the first time since he'd seen her, she didn't immediately move on. Instead, she waited, her head lowered, eyes fixed on the basin below, as if all the miles she had run were funneling toward this one place. Caleb followed her line of sight again, his pulse ticking louder in his ears. "All right," he said, the word rougher this time. "All right, I see it." The mare took a step toward the descent, then faltered. Her knees buckled slightly before she caught herself. Caleb reached out without thinking, his hand hovering near her neck, unsure whether touching her would help or hurt. She steadied, drawing in a shallow breath, and pressed on. The path down was no path at all. Caleb slid more than walked, grabbing at brush and rock to keep from losing his footing. Dust filled his nose and mouth. Behind him he heard the scrape of hooves as the mare followed, careful and determined despite the obvious pain it caused her. Halfway down he stopped, bracing himself against a juniper trunk. "Stay," he said, glancing back. "Just a second." She didn't stop. She came on, step by step, until she was close enough for him to feel the heat coming off her body. At the bottom, the basin closed in around them. The walls rose steep and close, blocking the wind and muting the sounds of the outside world. It felt like stepping into a place forgotten by time. Caleb's eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the scattered debris, old rope half buried in the dirt, a length of weathered wood that didn't belong, tracks pressed into the ground and hardened by days of sun. His breath caught. These weren't the signs of nature at work. They were the marks of human hands, careless, temporary, and gone. Caleb crouched, running his fingers over one of the tracks. It was small, hoof-shaped, fresh enough to still hold its form. Another set lay beside it, heavier, uneven, dragging slightly. Behind him, the mare let out a sound so soft he might have missed it if the basin weren't so quiet. It wasn't a whinny. It wasn't a call. It was a low, broken note that carried something raw and aching in it. Caleb stood slowly, his heart beginning to pound. "Okay," he said, though his voice wavered now. "Okay, I'm here." The mare stepped past him, deeper into the basin, her movements urgent again, despite her exhaustion. Caleb followed, every instinct telling him that whatever waited ahead would change the shape of his evening, and possibly far more than that. He didn't know yet what he was walking toward. He only knew that the footsteps leading him here had refused to fade, and that turning back now would mean leaving a question unanswered that he would carry for the rest of his life. He didn't know yet what he was walking toward, but standing at the bottom of the basin, Caleb Monroe felt the land close around him as if it were holding a secret too heavy to be spoken aloud. The mare moved past him again, deeper into the narrow cut of earth, her hooves sinking into softer ground where shade clung stubbornly to the soil. The smell grew stronger here, stale, sour, wrong. Caleb's instincts told him to slow down, to take stock, but the sound of her breathing behind him pushed him forward. It had changed. Each breath now rasped like it was being dragged through dry leaves. "Hold on," Caleb said, stopping abruptly. His voice echoed faintly off the rock walls. "Just hold on a minute." He reached for the canteen at his belt, the last of the water sloshing weakly inside. He turned, uncapped it, and lifted it toward her mouth. Up close, the damage was clearer than before. Her coat was dull and uneven, rubbed thin in places. Old scars mapped her sides in pale, uneven lines, memories of restraint rather than wilderness. Her eyes flicked to the canteen, then away. "No," Caleb murmured, surprised. "You need this." She stepped back, shaking her head once, sharply. The motion cost her. Her legs trembled, and she widened her stance to stay upright. Still she refused, turning instead toward the darker bend of the basin and taking 2 halting steps forward. Then she stopped and looked back at him again, not impatient, not confused, expectant. Caleb lowered the canteen slowly. Something about the gesture, her refusal, the way she conserved every scrap of strength, tightened the space behind his ribs. He had seen stubborn animals before. This wasn't stubbornness. This was calculation. "You're saving it," he said quietly, the realization landing with a dull weight. "You're not doing this for yourself." The mare didn't react, but she didn't move away either. She waited until he fell in beside her, then continued on, deeper into the basin where the light thinned and the air cooled. The walls rose higher here, the rock faces close enough that Caleb could reach out and touch them with both hands at once. Sound behaved differently. His boots scuffed louder, his breathing seemed intrusive, as though the place itself preferred silence. The mare slowed, her steps shortening, her head dipping lower with every few yards. Caleb watched her carefully now, alert to every hitch in her movement. When she stumbled, he reached out and steadied her without thinking, his palm pressing briefly against her shoulder. She flinched at the contact, then leaned into it, just for a second, before pulling away and continuing on. "I've got you," he said, unsure whether the words were meant to reassure her or himself. They rounded a bend, and the basin narrowed further, funneling them toward a cluster of boulders jammed together like careless hands had dropped them there. Rope lay tangled near the rocks, sun-bleached and stiff, half buried in the dirt. Caleb stopped again, his pulse quickening. He knelt, lifting a length of it. The fibers were frayed, cut clean in places where a blade had worked fast and without care. This wasn't abandonment by accident. Behind him, the mare let out that low sound again, closer now, threaded with urgency. She moved past him, weaving between the rocks with surprising familiarity, as if she had walked this path before. Caleb followed, his boots slipping slightly on loose gravel, heart thudding loud enough that he was sure she could hear it. He expected to see tracks. He expected signs. What he didn't expect was the stillness. It settled over the space beyond the rocks like a held breath. The ground leveled out into a small pocket of dirt ringed by stone, sheltered from wind and sun alike. For a moment Caleb saw nothing at all. Then his eyes adjusted. Something lay on the ground ahead, small, darker than the dirt beneath it, unmoving. Caleb froze. The mare reached it first. She lowered her head, nudging the shape gently, urgently, her movement suddenly stripped of all restraint. The sound she made this time broke cleanly, rising into the air in a thin, aching call that echoed once off the stone and then fell away. Caleb crossed the remaining distance on unsteady legs and dropped to his knees. It was a foal, too small, too still. Its sides barely moved, each breath shallow and uneven, like it was forgetting how to draw the next one. Its coat was matted with dirt and sweat, legs folded at wrong angles beneath its body. The smell was strongest here now. Fear, waste, confinement. "Oh," Caleb whispered, the word leaving him like air from a punctured tire. "Oh, no." He pressed 2 fingers gently against the foal's neck. A heartbeat answered him, faint but stubborn. Relief and dread collided in his chest, leaving him dizzy. He pulled the canteen free again, cupping a small amount of water in his palm and bringing it to the foal's mouth. The tiny head twitched, lips moving weakly, but it couldn't manage to swallow. Behind him, the mare stood guard, her body angled between Caleb and the narrow opening they had come through. Her legs shook violently now, exhaustion finally demanding its due, but she refused to lie down. Every line of her posture screamed vigilance, protection. Caleb looked up at her, meeting her eyes. "You ran all that way," he said hoarsely. "You left him to save him." The truth settled over him then, heavy and undeniable. The road, the chase, the refusal to drink. None of it had been desperation for herself. Every choice she had made, every mile she had forced her failing body to cover, had been measured against the life lying at their feet. "I hear you," Caleb said, his voice breaking despite himself. "I hear you." He checked his phone with shaking hands. No signal, not even a flicker. He cursed under his breath, scanning the basin walls, already calculating what it would take to climb out, how long help might take to reach them, even if he could call it. The sun was sliding lower now, the light angling in thin bands across the dirt. Time was turning against them. Caleb shrugged out of his shirt and draped it carefully over the foal's small body, trying to trap what little warmth remained. He poured a few drops of water onto the mare's lips despite her protest, just enough to wet them. She tolerated it, barely, then turned her attention back to the foal. "I'm not leaving," Caleb said, more firmly now. "Not either of you." The mare's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, and for the first time since he'd followed her into the basin, she lowered her head slightly, as if the weight she'd been carrying had shifted, just a fraction. Caleb sat back on his heels, the reality of their situation settling in around him. Whatever had happened here hadn't been quick, it hadn't been kind, and whoever had done it might not be far. The basin felt smaller now, the silence thicker. As the shadows crept longer across the ground, Caleb realized that finding the foal had not been the end of the journey the mare had dragged him into. It was only the beginning. It was only the beginning. That truth settled heavily on Caleb Monroe as he knelt beside the foal, the thin fabric of his shirt barely rising with the fragile breath beneath it. The basin, which had seemed merely isolated before, now felt intentional, shaped by neglect, hidden by design. This was not a place stumbled upon. It was a place chosen. Caleb forced himself to stand, every joint protesting, and took in the space with new eyes. The walls of rock curved inward, steep enough to block any line of sight from above. From the road, even from the ridge, nothing here would have been visible. The ground bore the quiet evidence of captivity. Scuffed dirt where small hooves had paced in circles, a shallow depression where water might once have been poured and then left to dry. Near one wall, a length of rope had been looped and retied so many times the fibers were polished smooth. "This wasn't a mistake," Caleb said softly. The mare flicked an ear at his voice but didn't look away from the foal. She stood over it like a living barricade, her legs braced wide despite the tremor that ran through them. When the foal shifted weakly, she lowered her head at once, touching its neck with her muzzle, breathing in and out against it as if trying to lend it her strength. Caleb crouched again, this time closer to the rock wall. He traced a boot print pressed deep into the dirt, the tread pattern still visible. Not old, a few days, maybe less. Whoever had been here hadn't gone far, not in time, if not in distance. The thought sent a ripple of unease through him. He straightened slowly, scanning the narrow entrance they had come through. "You're not safe here," he said, though whether he meant the horses or himself, he wasn't sure. The mare shifted then, taking one careful step toward him before stopping. Her eyes were fixed on his face now, sharp with something that felt like urgency sharpened into command. She nudged his arm again, harder this time, then turned her head toward the opening of the basin and back to the foal, as if drawing a line between the two. Caleb understood. "You're telling me to move him," he said, "but you can't." She snorted, frustrated, stamping once. The effort cost her. Her front knees buckled slightly before she caught herself, sides heaving. Caleb moved instinctively, steadying her again, and she allowed it this time, leaning into his hand for longer than before. He felt how light she was beneath his palm, how little substance there was to support all that will. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, we'll do this slow." He pulled the phone from his pocket again, holding it higher, angling it toward the sliver of sky visible between the rocks. Still nothing, not even a flicker of signal. He exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing himself to think past the rising panic. Emergency veterinary care wasn't a luxury out here, it was survival, but it might as well have been on the other side of the state for all the good it would do them right now. The sun had dipped lower, the light thinning into long, slanted bands that barely reached the basin floor. Caleb knew the temperature would drop fast once it disappeared completely. He had enough experience to know what shock looked like, and the foal was already flirting with it. "We're going to need warmth," he murmured, scanning his surroundings. "And water, and time we don't have." He stripped off his jacket and laid it beside the foal, piling what little brush he could find along one side to block the breeze. The mare watched every movement closely, her head turning in small, precise arcs. When he finished, she lowered herself carefully to the ground on the opposite side of the foal, folding her legs beneath her with a controlled slowness that spoke of both exhaustion and resolve. Caleb swallowed hard. "She's staying," he thought, "even if it costs her." The realization stirred something old and uncomfortable in him. A memory of promises kept when they were hardest to keep, of staying put when walking away would have been easier. He pushed it aside, focusing instead on the immediate problem. Darkness was coming, and with it, cold. Caleb stood and moved toward the entrance of the basin, climbing partway up the slope until he could see the land beyond. Nothing stirred, no vehicles, no figures moving against the horizon, just empty high plains stretching out under a sky already losing its color. He slid back down, his boots kicking loose stones ahead of him, and returned to the small pocket of life at the basin's heart. The foal's breathing had grown more uneven, pauses stretching longer between shallow draws of air. Caleb knelt again, one hand hovering near its chest, feeling the faint rise and fall. "Stay with me," he whispered, unsure whether the words were meant for the foal or the mare. "We're not done yet." The mare lifted her head at the sound of his voice, her gaze softening just slightly. She reached out and touched his shoulder with her muzzle, once, briefly, before turning back to her foal. The contact startled him more than he expected. It felt deliberate. Acknowledgement. As the last of the sunlight slipped away, the basin darkened into a bowl of shadow. Sounds sharpened, the scrape of insects, the distant call of something wild moving across the plain. Caleb pulled his hat lower, settling in beside the horses, his back against the cold stone. This place had been chosen to hide suffering, he realized, to make it quiet, invisible. But it wasn't invisible anymore. Caleb Monroe had followed a starving mare into a place humans were never meant to find, and now that he was here, leaving was no longer an option. Whatever came next, help, danger, confrontation, it would find him standing between it and the two lives that had trusted him enough to ask. He glanced once more toward the narrow opening of the basin, listening to the silence beyond it, and wondered how long they had before someone else remembered this place existed. The basin had gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if the land itself were waiting to see what Caleb Monroe would do next. Night settled in layers rather than all at once. The sky above the narrow cut of rock deepened from pale blue to bruised purple, and the last warmth of the day drained from the ground beneath his boots. Caleb shifted closer to the foal, angling his body to block what little breeze found its way down into the hollow. The mare watched him constantly now, not with fear, not even with distrust, but with an alertness that suggested she was listening for something beyond the reach of human senses. Her ears twitched at sounds Caleb barely registered. A scrape of stone somewhere above them, the distant crack of dry brush shifting in the wind. Each time her head lifted sharply, muscles tightening beneath her skin. "You hear something I don't," Caleb murmured. She didn't respond, but the tension in her posture didn't ease. If anything, it sharpened. Caleb checked his phone again, knowing the result before he did it. Still nothing. No bars. No way to call emergency veterinary services. No way to alert anyone who might bring a trailer, fluids, or even basic medical supplies. Out here, insurance policies and liability waivers didn't mean much. There was no backup plan hiding in fine print, just choices and the cost of making them. The foal stirred weakly beneath his jacket, a small shudder running through its body. Caleb leaned closer, counting breaths, feeling the faint heat still clinging to its skin. Too little, too slow. He loosened his belt and gently fashioned a loose wrap to help keep the foal from rolling, improvising the way you did when there was no one else coming. Behind him, the mare shifted her weight and rose again despite the obvious pain it caused her. She moved closer to the basin wall, positioning herself so her body blocked the narrow opening. It was a subtle change, but unmistakable. She wasn't guarding the foal from the cold. She was guarding it from whatever lay outside. Caleb followed her gaze, his pulse ticking faster now. The darkness beyond the rock seemed thicker than it had moments before, shadows pooling in ways that made distance hard to judge. He strained to hear past the blood rushing in his ears. At first there was nothing. Then, faint, almost imperceptible, a sound that didn't belong to wind or wildlife. Footsteps. Not close. Not rushing. Measured. Patient. Caleb's spine stiffened. He rose slowly, careful not to startle the mare, and stepped closer to her shoulder. The foal lay between them, small and vulnerable, the reason none of this had been optional. "Easy," Caleb whispered, though his own hands had begun to shake. "I've got you." The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed in again, heavier now, charged with intent. Caleb felt the shape of the moment forming, the way a storm announced itself long before the first drop of rain. He glanced down at the rope, half buried near the rock wall, then at the boot prints he'd seen earlier. The pieces aligned with a clarity he didn't like. Whoever had left these horses here hadn't forgotten them. The mare snorted sharply, stamping once, dust puffing up around her hoof. It was the first openly aggressive sound she'd made since Caleb had met her. Her ears pinned back, and she lowered her head slightly, not to flee, but to brace. Caleb took a breath, steadying himself. He thought of all the practical reasons this was a bad idea: trespassing laws, personal safety, the reality that confronting another person out here could go wrong in ways insurance would never cover. He thought of the truck miles away on the road, of the sensible choice he could have made hours ago. Then he looked at the foal. "No," he said quietly, the words solidifying into resolve. "You don't get to come back for them." A shadow shifted near the entrance of the basin, resolving slowly into the outline of a man standing just beyond the rocks. He didn't step fully into view at first. He didn't need to. His presence alone changed the air, tightening it. "You're a long way off the road," the man said at last, his voice carrying easily despite the distance. "Calm, too calm. This isn't a place folks usually wander into by accident." Caleb straightened, positioning himself squarely between the man and the horses. "Didn't wander," he replied. "I was led." The man chuckled softly, buoy, a sound without humor. "That is so?" The mare shifted closer to Caleb, her shoulder brushing his arm, a silent alignment. The man took one step forward, enough for the light to catch the brim of his hat, the outline of his jacket. Caleb noticed the way he moved, confident, unhurried, like someone who believed time was on his side. "You found something that doesn't belong to you," the man said. "Best thing you can do is just turn around and forget you ever saw it." Caleb felt the weight of that suggestion settle between them. Forgetting was easy. People did it every day. He could walk away now, tell himself he had done what he could, let the law or fate sort out the rest. The mare answered for him. She stepped forward, placing her body fully in front of the foal, legs trembling but locked in place. Her head lowered further, teeth bared in a warning that needed no translation. In the low light, her eyes burned with something fierce and unmistakable. The man stopped. For the first time since he'd appeared, uncertainty flickered across his posture. He hadn't expected resistance, certainly not from an animal that looked one hard push away from collapse. Caleb didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, feeling the quiet strength of the mare beside him, understanding at last what she had been hiding them from all along. She hadn't led him here to save her child from the land. She had led him here to save it from a man who planned to return. The man's boots scraped against the stone as he shifted his weight, testing the ground the way someone did when they were deciding how much trouble a situation might be worth. The basin held the sound, magnifying it until it seemed louder than it should have been. Caleb Monroe didn't move. He stood with his shoulders squared, the mare's heat steady against his arm, the foal's faint breathing behind him like a fragile clock counting down. "You don't want to make this complicated," the man said, his voice still level, still calm. "These animals aren't yours. They never were. Caleb kept his eyes on the man's face, committing details to memory, the way he'd learned to do when something felt like it might matter later. The narrow set of the eyes, the relaxed mouth that didn't quite reach them, the way his hand rested near his belt without touching anything. "They don't belong to you either," Caleb replied. "Not like this." A thin smile tugged at the corner of the man's mouth. "You'd be surprised how ownership works out here." The mare shifted again, her hoof scraping dirt as she adjusted her stance. Her strength was failing. Caleb could feel it in the subtle tremor running through her body. Still, she held her ground, refusing to give the man a clear path forward. The message was simple and absolute. The man took another step closer. Caleb raised one hand, not threatening, not pleading, just enough to mark a boundary. "That's close enough." For a moment no one spoke. The quiet stretched, taut as wire. Somewhere above them, a night insect buzzed and fell silent again. The man's gaze flicked briefly to the mare, then to the foal, then back to Caleb, calculating. "You walked into something you don't understand," he said finally. "There are easier ways to get hurt than picking fights over animals." Caleb felt the old anger rise then, not hot and reckless, but cold and focused. He thought of the rope marks on the mare's sides, of the foal's shallow breaths, of the miles she'd run until her body nearly gave out. He thought of all the times people had looked away because it was easier to call something complicated than to call it wrong. "I understand enough," he said. "I understand that you left them here to break. I understand that you planned to come back when you thought no one was watching." The man's expression hardened, the faint smile disappearing. "You don't have proof." Caleb nodded slowly. "Maybe not yet." The implication hung between them. Out here, proof didn't always come in neat packages. Sometimes it came later, carried in the form of witnesses, records, patterns that added up once someone decided to look closely enough. The man knew it. Caleb could see the shift, the way his confidence thinned just enough to let irritation show through. "This ends one of two ways," the man said, his voice lower now. "You walk away, and nothing happens. Or you stay, and things get messy." Caleb glanced back at the mare, meeting her eye. She held his gaze for a long second, something steady and deliberate passing between them. Then he looked down at the foal, small and quiet beneath the jacket, still fighting to stay tethered to the world. "I'm staying," Caleb said. The words landed with a finality that surprised even him. The man exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly, as if disappointed. "Suit yourself." He took a step to the side, angling as though to circle around Caleb rather than push past him directly. The mare reacted instantly, shifting to block the movement, her body cutting off the narrow space. The effort was too much. Her front leg buckled, and she dipped dangerously low before managing to brace herself again. Caleb felt a spike of fear cut through his resolve. He moved with her this time, one hand pressed firmly against her shoulder, lending her his weight. She leaned into him, breath coming fast and shallow, but she didn't back away. "Easy," Caleb murmured, his voice rough now. "You don't have to do this alone." The man stopped again, reassessing. The sight of the mare, starving, shaking, still refusing to yield, had clearly unsettled him more than Caleb's words ever could have. This wasn't the easy retrieval he'd expected. It wasn't clean. "You're making a mistake," he said, though there was less certainty in it now. "Maybe," Caleb replied, "but it's one I can live with." The man stood there a moment longer, the darkness pressing in around them, then took a step back. Then another. He didn't turn away completely, not yet, but the retreat was unmistakable. "This isn't over," he said. "You can't watch them forever." Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. The mare's breathing steadied just a fraction as the distance between them grew, her muscles easing enough to let her stand without shaking quite so violently. When the man finally disappeared beyond the rocks, the basin seemed to exhale. Caleb remained where he was long after the footsteps faded, his senses stretched thin, listening for any sign that the threat might return. Only when he was sure the night had swallowed the man completely did he allow himself to kneel again beside the foal. "You hear that?" he whispered, though the foal didn't stir. "You bought us some time." He checked the foal's breathing again, counting carefully. Still shallow, still weak. Time was a luxury they didn't have, but at least now it was theirs for the moment. He pulled the jacket tighter, then reached for the mare, rubbing slow circles along her neck to keep her from collapsing entirely. "You did good," he told her quietly. "You did exactly what you needed to do." She lowered her head at last, resting it briefly against his shoulder. The contact was heavy, trusting, and it hit Caleb harder than the confrontation had. He stayed like that for a while, 3 lives balanced in a fragile truce with the night. Somewhere far off, an engine hummed and faded again, too distant to be help, too real to ignore. Caleb lifted his head, listening, hope and worry tangling together in his chest. The line had been drawn. He had crossed it without stepping back. Now all that remained was to hold it long enough for morning, and whatever it might bring, to arrive. The night closed in after the man was gone, not all at once, but inch by inch, until the basin felt sealed off from the rest of the world. Caleb Monroe sat with his back against the rock wall, knees drawn up, the mare's shoulder warm against his side. The foal lay between them, wrapped in fabric and shadow, its breathing a thin thread Caleb kept listening for, afraid of the moment he wouldn't hear it any more. He checked his watch and then stopped checking it. Time behaved strangely down here. Minutes stretched, then collapsed. The cold crept in through the soles of his boots and the stone at his back, settling into his bones with the patience of something that knew it would win eventually. He rubbed his hands together, then rubbed them along the mare's neck, slow and steady, not to warm her so much as to remind her she wasn't alone. "Stay with me," he murmured, his voice barely louder than the foal's breath. "Just stay." The mare's head dipped, her weight leaning into him. Each time the foal shuddered, she lifted her muzzle and touched it, breathing against the small body as if counting the same fragile rhythm Caleb was. The basin amplified every sound, the scrape of fabric, the whisper of breath, the distant cry of something moving across the plain above them. Coyotes, maybe, or just the wind playing tricks on tired nerves. Caleb's thoughts wandered in the dark. He thought about the last time he'd sat through a night like this, waiting for something he couldn't control. Years ago now, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and coffee gone cold. He pushed the memory aside, focusing instead on the present, on what his hands could do. Adjust the jacket, shield the foal from the draft, keep the mare upright when her legs threatened to fold. He shifted carefully and reached for the canteen, weighing it in his palm. Not much left. He tipped a few drops onto his fingers and touched them to the mare's lips. She resisted at first, then accepted the smallest amount, swallowing with effort. When he tried the same with the foal, he waited patiently, letting the moisture rest against its mouth, until finally the tiniest movement answered him. "That's it," he whispered, a smile tugging at his mouth despite everything. "That's good." The hours dragged. Caleb stood once, stretching cramped muscles, and climbed a short way up the slope to peer toward the opening of the basin. The stars were sharp above him, the sky clear and indifferent. He held his phone up again, turning slowly, searching for a signal that refused to exist. When he climbed back down, the mare watched him closely, relief flickering through her posture when he returned to her side. "I'm not going anywhere," he told her. "Not yet." Sometime after midnight, the foal's breathing changed. It grew slower, more deliberate, the pauses longer. Caleb felt a tightness clamp around his chest. He leaned closer, one hand hovering, afraid to touch too much, afraid not to. The mare noticed at once, lifting her head, her ears pricked forward. "Easy," Caleb said, though his voice shook now. "Easy." He talked then, filling the basin with words because silence felt like surrender. He spoke about the ranch, about the creek that still held water even in dry years, about grass that came up green and soft after the first good rain. He spoke about mornings when the light broke clean and gold across open land, and evenings when the work was done and nothing hurt quite so much. He didn't know if the foal could hear him. He knew only that stopping felt impossible. The mare listened, her breathing evening out slightly, her head lowering as if the cadence of his voice gave her something to lean on. When Caleb's throat grew raw, he kept going anyway, letting the words tumble out wherever they wanted to go. At some point, exhaustion took a piece of him despite his best efforts. His eyes closed for a moment, just a moment, and his head tipped forward. He woke with a start, heart racing, certain something had changed. He checked the foal at once, relief washing through him, when he felt the faint, stubborn rhythm still there. "Sorry," he whispered, more to himself than to either of them. "Didn't mean to drift." The night pressed on. Cold deepened. The mare's legs shook again, and she sank down onto her chest with a soft, defeated sound, still angled protectively toward the foal. Caleb shifted to support her, bracing her with his shoulder, sharing what strength he had left. Then, sometime in the hour before dawn, he heard it. At first it was only a suggestion of sound, so faint he wondered if he'd imagined it. A low, distant hum that didn't belong to wind or wildlife. Caleb lifted his head, holding his breath, listening hard. The sound came again, steadier this time. An engine. Hope flared, sharp and dangerous. He climbed part way up the slope again, straining his eyes toward the dark land beyond the basin. The sound grew, then faded, then returned, as if whatever it belonged to was moving along the road above them, not stopping, not slowing. "Hey," Caleb called, his voice carrying poorly in the open air. He waved his arms, though he knew it was useless. The hum receded, swallowed by distance. He slid back down, the brief spike of hope leaving him more tired than before. The mare watched him, her gaze searching his face, and he forced a small smile he didn't quite feel. "Soon," he said, not knowing who he was trying to convince. "Morning's coming." And it did, eventually. The first hint of light touched the upper rim of the basin, a thin gray line that slowly widened. The air shifted, losing some of its bite. The foal drew a breath that sounded a little stronger than the last. Caleb laughed softly, the sound breaking free before he could stop it. "There you are," he whispered. "You're still here." The mare lifted her head, ears turning toward the light, exhaustion and something like relief softening her expression. She leaned into Caleb again, her weight heavy but trusting. As dawn crept lower into the basin, painting the rocks with pale gold, Caleb knew they had made it through the worst of the night. Not safe, not saved, but still breathing, still together. He rested his forehead briefly against the mare's neck, eyes closed, letting the light touch them all. Morning had found them. Now it only needed to find help. Morning had found them, but it didn't bring answers with it. The light slid down the basin walls in cautious increments, touching stone, rope, and dust, before finally reaching the small circle where Caleb Monroe sat with the horses. The cold loosened its grip just enough to make movement possible again, though every joint in Caleb's body protested when he shifted his weight. The mare lifted her head, ears flicking toward the rim above them, alert despite the exhaustion that dragged at her limbs. Daylight revealed the cost of the night in harsher detail. Her flanks hollow, her legs streaked with dried sweat and dirt, her breath still shallow and uneven. The foal breathed too, and that fact alone felt like a fragile victory. Caleb rose slowly, testing his balance, and climbed the slope again, higher this time, until his hands found purchase on a narrow ledge near the basin's edge. From there he could see farther across the plains, the land opening wide and empty beneath a sky washed clean of stars. The road lay somewhere beyond the low rise to the east, out of sight but close enough that he imagined he could feel its pull. He raised his phone once more. Still nothing. "Come on," he muttered, turning in a slow circle, just once. The screen remained stubbornly blank. No signal. No help arriving neatly on schedule. Caleb closed his eyes for a second, forcing himself to breathe past the creeping frustration. He had known this wouldn't be simple. Morning hadn't changed that. It had only stripped away the comfort of darkness, leaving him with clear choices and fewer excuses. He climbed back down, careful not to dislodge loose stones, and knelt beside the foal. Again. Its eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused, then slid shut. Caleb checked its gums, his heart sinking at the pale color. Dehydration. Shock. Time was no longer just an enemy. It was a thief. "We can't stay here," he said quietly. The mare lifted her head at his voice, watching him closely. When he rose and moved toward the entrance of the basin, she struggled to her feet, swaying but determined. She took one step after him, then another, stopping only when he turned back and held up a hand. "Not yet," he said. "I need to see what we're dealing with." He eased out of the basin, keeping low as he crested the ridge. The world above felt too open after the closeness below, the wind sharper, the sounds louder. He scanned the land carefully, north, south, west, looking for anything out of place. No trucks, no figures moving against the horizon. Just grassland and sky. The man from the night before was gone. Relief came first, quick and shallow. It was followed immediately by a harder truth. The absence didn't mean safety. It meant uncertainty. Whoever had put the horses in that basin had done it deliberately. He might return, or send someone else, or wait. Caleb turned his gaze toward the road. If he could get the horses there, if he could flag someone down, everything would change. Emergency veterinary care, transport, documentation. The kind of help that turned a crisis into a case file, something that couldn't be quietly erased. He did the math in his head, and didn't like the answer. The mare couldn't make it that far. Not carrying herself, not with the foal in this condition. And moving the foal alone, even a short distance, might be more than its body could tolerate. Caleb felt the weight of the decision pressed down on him, heavy and unyielding. He slid back into the basin and sat again, rubbing his hands over his face. The mare watched him, reading his posture the way animals read weather. She took a few unsteady steps closer, stopping just short of touching him, her presence steady and insistent. "I know," Caleb said, his voice rough. "I know." He reached for the canteen and shook it. Barely enough for a few more attempts. He poured a capful into his palm and offered it to the foal, waiting patiently until the tiny mouth moved again, accepting just enough to matter. Then he turned to the mare, offering her the same. She drank this time without protest, exhaustion finally overriding instinct. "That's good," he told her. "You need it." Caleb stood again, decision settling into place. He couldn't move them safely yet, but he could prepare. He gathered what little he could find, branches to mark the basin entrance, scraps of cloth torn from his shirt to tie where they might be visible from above. He climbed back up and arranged them carefully, a quiet signal to anyone who knew how to look. When he returned, the mare watched his hands with focused attention. She nudged his arm, then turned her, head toward the foal and back again, a simple question asked without words. "I'm here," Caleb said, answering it. "I'm not going anywhere." The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher, warming the basin floor, drawing moisture from the earth and from them all. Caleb rationed what little water remained, careful and deliberate, watching for any sign, any sound that might mean help was closer than it had been all night. Then, just past mid-morning, he heard it. Not the low hum from the night before, not distant and passing, but a sharper sound this time, an engine slowing, tires crunching gravel, a door opening somewhere above them. Caleb's heart leaped painfully in his chest. He scrambled up the slope, waving his arms, shouting until his throat burned. "Hey!" he called. "Down here!" The sound paused. Silence stretched. Then a voice drifted back, faint but unmistakably human. "Is someone there?" Caleb laughed, the sound breaking out of him raw and unfiltered. "Yes," he shouted. "Yes, there is." He slid back down the slope on unsteady legs, turning toward the mare and the foal, his grin trembling at the edges. "We've got someone," he told them, breathless. "We've got a chance." The mare lifted her head, ears pricked toward the sound above. She didn't move closer to the entrance. She stayed where she was, beside her foal, waiting. Caleb looked at her and understood. Morning hadn't brought safety. It had brought a door, and now it was up to him to make sure what came through it stayed long enough to matter. The voice above the basin belonged to a man named Owen Hartley, a survey contractor who'd pulled his truck onto the shoulder after noticing the strange markings Caleb had tied to the brush. He was middle-aged, cautious, and clearly unsettled by what he saw when Caleb led him down the narrow slope. The basin revealed itself slowly to him, the rope, the scuffed dirt, the exhausted mare standing like a shield over her foal. Owen swore under his breath, the sound sharp in the quiet. "My God," he said, "how long have they been down here?" "Too long," Caleb replied. "We need help, a vet, transport, and we need it now." Owen didn't argue. He pulled out his phone, already dialing, stepping back up the slope to find a signal strong enough to carry urgency. Caleb returned to the basin, kneeling beside the foal, counting breaths again, measuring hope in fractions. The mare watched every movement with focused intensity, her body still angled protectively, but something in her posture had changed. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, like a knot loosening just enough to breathe. It took longer than Caleb wanted. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed, heat returning with a dry insistence that made the air shimmer again. Owen came back down once, offering water, his face pale. "They're on the way," he said. "County Animal Services, and a large animal vet. Closest one they could reach." Caleb nodded, too tired to thank him properly. He poured water carefully, drop by drop, into the foal's mouth, then let the mare drink until her knees trembled again. He supported her as she leaned into him, her weight light and alarming. The sound of engines arrived before the vehicles themselves. 2 trucks, then a third, stopping hard at the edge of the basin. People moved carefully down the slope, voices low, hands already busy. The vet introduced herself as Dr. Elaine Mercer, her manner brisk, but her eyes softening immediately when she took in the scene. "We're going to stabilize the foal first," she said. "Then the mare." Needles, IV bags, careful hands. The basin turned into a small island of controlled urgency. Caleb held the fluid bag high, his arm shaking, watching color slowly return to the foal's gums. The mare stood through it all, trembling but present, her eyes never leaving her baby. Dr. Mercer paused at one point, her gaze lingering on the mare's scars. She ran her fingers gently along one mark, then another, her brow furrowing. "This isn't a feral horse," she said quietly. Caleb looked up. "What do you mean?" "She's been handled," the vet replied. "Tied, worked, probably for years. These aren't injuries from the wild." The words settled over Caleb with a strange, hollow weight. He looked at the mare again, not just at her hunger, not just at her fear, but at the discipline in her movements, the way she'd guided him, waited for him, trusted him with decisions. Pieces slid into place with uncomfortable clarity. "She wasn't born wild," he said. Dr. Mercer shook her head. "No, she was made that way." When the foal was finally lifted onto a stretcher, the mare tried to follow despite her weakness, panic flaring fresh in her eyes. Caleb stepped in close, his hand firm against her neck. "Easy," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "They're taking him to help. I'll be right here." She hesitated, then allowed herself to be led, step by careful step, toward the waiting trailer. The moment the foal was secured inside, she let out a long, shaking breath and leaned heavily against the side, her strength finally spent. As the basin emptied, as evidence was photographed and rope collected, Caleb stood back and watched. The place looked smaller now, stripped of secrecy, its silence broken for good. One of the officers approached him, asking questions, taking notes. Caleb answered when he could, his eyes following the mare and foal as they were loaded, kept close together. When the vehicles pulled away at last, the dust hung in the air like a memory that didn't want to settle. Caleb climbed into his truck, hands resting on the steering wheel, exhaustion crashing over him in waves. The mare's eyes met his through the slats of the trailer one last time before the door closed. There was no fear in them now, only recognition, as Caleb pulled back onto the road, following the convoy toward town and emergency veterinary care. He understood something that would not let him go. The truth hadn't just followed them out of the basin, it had chosen him. The county veterinary facility sat on the edge of town, a low sprawl of clean white buildings surrounded by wire fencing and wide gravel lanes. By the time Caleb Monroe arrived behind the trailer, the adrenaline that had carried him out of the basin was finally draining away, leaving a deep, aching fatigue in its wake. He parked and sat for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly, grounding himself before he stepped out. Inside the barn, the air was cool and smelled faintly of disinfectant and hay. The foal lay on a padded stall mat under warm lights, IV lines running into its thin neck, chest rising and falling with a steadier rhythm than Caleb had dared hope for. Dr. Elaine Mercer moved around it with quiet efficiency, checking vitals, adjusting flow rates, murmuring to herself as much as to the staff assisting her. "He's holding," she said when she noticed Caleb standing in the doorway. "That's more than we had a right to expect yesterday." Caleb nodded, unable to find words that wouldn't crack if he tried to say them. He turned then, drawn by an instinct he no longer questioned, and found the mare in the adjacent stall. She stood under a heat lamp, fluids dripping slowly into her vein, her head lowered, but her eyes alert. When she saw him, she lifted her head at once. It was subtle, the shift, but unmistakable. Caleb stepped closer, resting his forearms on the stall rail. "Hey," he said softly. "You made it." The mare breathed out, a long, weary exhale that seemed to empty something she'd been holding onto for far too long. Up close, now that the dust and fear had been washed away, he could see more clearly what Dr. Mercer had meant. The way she stood, the way she watched people move. This was not the posture of an animal shaped entirely by the wild. Dr. Mercer joined him, lowering her voice. "We'll keep them together," she said, "as much as possible. She's the reason he's alive. Separating them would do more harm than good." "Thank you," Caleb replied. It felt like the smallest word in the world, and still not enough. Over the next several days, Caleb returned to the facility whenever he could. He brought paperwork when asked, answered questions from Animal Services, gave statements to a deputy who took the situation far more seriously now that evidence and witnesses existed. There were mentions of illegal holding practices, of prior complaints, of an investigation that would move forward quietly but steadily. Caleb listened, nodded, signed where needed. What mattered more to him happened in the quiet hours. Each day, the foal grew a little stronger. Its eyes stayed open longer. Its legs began to twitch with the instinct to stand. The mare watched, every small improvement with fierce attention, her ears turning at the slightest sound from the neighboring stall. When Caleb entered, she acknowledged him with a small lift of her head, a recognition that no longer surprised him. One afternoon, as he brushed dried mud from her coat under the supervision of a technician, Caleb noticed something beneath the thinning hair on her flank. A mark, faint but unmistakable, revealed slowly as he worked, a symbol burned into the skin long ago, softened by time, but still there. He froze. Dr. Mercer saw it too and leaned closer. "That's a ranch brand," she said. "Older style." Caleb's breath caught painfully in his chest. He reached out, rubbing gently until the lines became clear. A simple design, one he had seen before, one he had not thought about in years because thinking about it hurt too much. "That brand belonged to my neighbor," he said, his voice barely audible. "They sold off their horses after a foreclosure. Years back." Dr. Mercer looked at him carefully. "You think she came from there?" "I don't think," Caleb replied. "I know." The realization hit him with a slow, crushing weight. This mare had once stood in a pasture with fences and feed, with a name spoken by someone who knew her. She had not been born to run until she bled. She had been forced into it. When the foal finally stood for the first time, legs wobbling, collapsing back down after only a second, Caleb laughed through tears he hadn't felt coming. The mare stepped closer, touching her nose to her baby's shoulder, steadying him with a patience that spoke of long, quiet devotion. Weeks passed. The foal grew stronger, nursing on its own, moving with the unsteady confidence of something learning what life could be. The mare filled out slowly, her ribs less visible now, her coat beginning to shine again. The staff spoke of rehabilitation plans, of placement, of long-term care options. Caleb listened, and then spoke. "I've got room," he said one afternoon, "and I've got time." The paperwork took longer than the decision. When the trailer finally pulled into his ranch weeks later, the land looked different to him. Not changed, but newly noticed. The grass by the creek was green from late rains. The fences held. The barn stood open and waiting. The mare stepped down first, cautious but calm. The foal followed, sticking close to her side. They paused together, taking in the open space, the quiet, the absence of threat. Then the mare moved forward, slow and deliberate, leading her child into the field. Caleb watched from the gate, his chest tight with something that felt dangerously close to peace. She turned back once, meeting his eyes across the distance. There was no fear there now, no urgency, just a steady presence, grounded and alive. The miles she had run through heat, hunger and fear had not been in vain. They had led her home. If this story stayed with you, take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment when an animal seemed to understand something before a human did? Your words matter here. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. More real stories of compassion, courage, and quiet miracles are waiting.